You challenge my authority, Chiamaka. Feeding the rejected is an act of defiance, encouraging others to disobey.
There are women who cook for kings, and the world knows their names. And there are women who cook for the people the world has forgotten, the sick, the accused, the ones who sit at the edge of a village and wonder whether the village still considers them part of it. And the world does not know their names at all, because the world was not watching. What you are about to witness is the story of a woman the village had stopped watching, of what she fed the people no one else would feed, of what those people, over 3 years, quietly gave her back, and of a man who sat down one evening at her fire and ate her food and made a decision that changed everything. Not because he was a king, but because the food told him something that no official report had been able to tell him, and he was the kind of man who listened to what food said. Her name was Chiamaka. She was 26 years old, and she had been feeding the outcasts of Aguobi for 3 years. Every evening, without exception, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission or seeking anyone's approval. The outcasts were the usual collection that villages produce. The man with the skin condition the village had decided was contagious. The woman whose husband had died under circumstances the elders found unclear. The young man who had refused a land assignment from the village head and been quietly excluded from the market's cooperative networks. The elderly healer whose methods had fallen out of favor when the new district physician arrived. Chiamaka fed them because they were hungry and she could cook, and because the village's decision about who deserved to be fed struck her every evening as she carried her pot to the edge of the compound wall, as the specific kind of wrong that is easier to correct than to argue about. She did not know that one of the people eating her food, a quiet man who had been sitting at her fire for 2 weeks, asking nothing and offering nothing, simply present each evening the way weather is present, had a ring in the fold of his cloth that he had removed before arriving each night, and that bore the seal of the royal house of Aguobi's governing district. She did not know that what he had been listening to, across 14 evenings of her food and her fire, and the conversations of people who spoke freely because they believed no one important was present, was a story about the village head that was more complete and more damning than anything the district's formal inquiry had produced in 6 months. She did not know any of this. On the 14th evening, he would put the ring on the ground between them, but first they were going to take her fire. But first they were going to take her pot, and her fire, and the compound wall she cooked against. And they were going to do it in front of everyone, on a Thursday morning, because the village head had decided that a woman feeding outcasts was a woman doing something that needed to be stopped. And that Thursday morning was when he had the most witnesses available. What they did not know was that the witnesses would remember Thursday differently than he intended. Chiamaka was 26 years old and had grown up in the cooking tradition of her mother's compound, which was not a tradition of celebration food or feast food, but of medicinal food, the specific, deliberate preparation of ingredients for their effect on the body rather than their pleasure on the tongue. Her mother had been what the older generation called a pot healer, a woman who knew that fever responded to specific broths, that certain joint conditions improved with particular roots added to everyday stews, that the grinding preparation of certain seeds before cooking changed their effect on the body entirely, and that most of what the body needed to recover could be provided through what it ate if the cook knew what they were doing. Chiamaka had learned all of it and had added to it because she had spent 15 years cooking for sick people, and sick people gave you the most honest feedback available. Either they improved or they did not, and there was no politeness in the response. She knew what she knew because it had been tested, repeatedly, against the most unforgiving standard possible. The man with the skin condition had been eating at her fire for 8 months, and his condition, which the district physician had declared untreatable and infectious, had been neither. It had been a reaction to something he was eating elsewhere, and when she had identified it and adjusted what she served him, it had resolved. The elderly healer came not only for the food but to talk, because Kiyomaka was one of the few people in Aguobi who could discuss what she was doing and why in the specific language of preparation and effect. They had been exchanging knowledge at her fire for 2 years. She had one habit so old she no longer thought about it as a habit. Before she began any preparation, before she added anything to a pot, she would smell the ingredient first, then close her eyes and hold it for a moment, and then decide. Her mother had called it asking the ingredient what it was ready for. Kiyomaka called it knowing what you are working with. The result was the same. She did not add things to food without understanding them, and she did not prepare food without being completely present to what the food was doing. This habit, unremarkable to her, was the thing that had made her food do things that other people's food did not do. She had simply been paying attention for 30 years in a way that most people paid attention to nothing. What the village did not know, what the village had decided it did not need to know. Because a woman who feeds outcasts had already been placed in a category, the village found it more comfortable not to examine. Was that 3 of the people currently eating Kiyomaka's food had been recovering from conditions the district physician had told them were permanent, and that one of them was the elderly healer, and that the healer had been keeping a careful record of what Kiyomaka served and what it produced, because she had been a record keeper her entire professional life, and old habits do not die simply because a district physician has decided your methods are outdated. Village head Ikechukwu Nanadi was 55 years old and had led Aguobi for 14 years, long enough to have made the village's system so thoroughly his that most people had stopped distinguishing between what the village did and what Ikechukwu had decided the village did. He was not cruel in the ordinary sense. He was a man who had organized the world around a clear and detailed theory of order, and who responded to disruptions of that order, not with anger, but with the particular, efficient displeasure of someone whose machine has developed an unexpected noise. Kiyomaka feeding the outcasts was an unexpected noise. It complicated the message that exclusion was supposed to send, that the village's judgments had consequences, that the categories the village maintained meant something, and it did so visibly, every evening, at the compound wall, in plain sight of anyone who passed. He had tolerated it for 2 years because direct action against a woman who was feeding hungry people would have produced a response he preferred to avoid. Instead, he had worked, the way he always worked, through the systems he controlled. The market cooperative had stopped accepting Kiyomaka's produce 6 months ago on a quality complaint that 2 of her neighbors, who owed Ikechukwu favors, had filed simultaneously. The compound wall she cooked against was technically on land whose maintenance responsibility the village council had recently reclassified, giving Ikechukwu's office the authority to declare it a hazard. The wood she used for cooking came from a communal source whose access he could restrict through a dry season fuel allocation he had been adjusting for 3 months. He had been building the conditions for her removal for half a year, and on Thursday morning he had all of them ready at once. What Ikechukwu had not built into his calculation was the district's formal inquiry. 6 months earlier, the governing district had opened an investigation into land allocation irregularities in several villages, including Aguobi, an investigation prompted by complaints from precisely the kind of people who had no formal standing to complain and therefore found informal ways to do it. Ikechukwu knew about the investigation. He had managed it with the same efficiency he managed everything, cooperating fully with every official request, producing every document requested, being visible and helpful and transparent in all the ways that a man who has had 14 years to ensure his visible record is clean can be transparent. He was confident. He had been managing district inquiries for 14 years. They never found anything because he had long ago learned where to keep things. He had not accounted for a district prince who did not conduct his investigations through official channels. Prince Chukwudi was 30 years old and was the district's second son, assigned to the land inquiry not because he was the most senior official available, but because he had a specific and somewhat unusual method that his father had found useful in situations where official channels had been producing clean results for too long. He did not announce himself. He did not arrive with staff or livery or the visible apparatus of authority that told a village head that a careful performance was required. He arrived as what he appeared to be, a man in ordinary clothing, traveling alone, asking whether there was anywhere nearby to sit and eat, because he had been on the road, and the road had been long. He had been directed by a woman at the market edge who seemed to know where everyone in the village ate, to the compound wall at the eastern edge of Agu Obi, where a woman cooked every evening for whoever came. He had gone, he had sat, he had eaten, and he had done what he always did in these situations, nothing except listen and pay attention, because the food was good and the people eating it were interesting, and the woman who had cooked it moved around her fire with the specific, unhurried authority of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and had no need to demonstrate it to anyone. He had returned the following evening, and the one after. He had removed his ring, the district seal ring that he wore on his right hand, before the first visit and kept it in the fold of his cloth throughout, because a ring of that kind changes what people say around you, and he needed to hear what people said when they believed no one important was present. He had eaten her food for 14 evenings, and across those 14 evenings, at her fire, the outcasts of Agu Obi had told him, not to him, not knowing he was listening in any official capacity, simply talking among themselves in the way that people talk when they are eating together, and the food is good and the evening is quiet. Everything that the district's formal inquiry had failed to produce about Ikechukwu Nnadi's 14 years of managing the village's assets in directions that benefited his household considerably more than the village's records acknowledged. He had been building the case in his head for 2 weeks. He needed 3 more things before he could act on it. The elderly healer's records, which he had been told about but not yet seen, a formal witness account from someone with standing, and the specific triggering event that would allow him to intervene in Agu Obi's affairs without overstepping the district's authority over local village governance. He had not yet found the triggering event. On Thursday morning, Ikechukwu provided it. The village head arrived at the compound wall at the hour when the morning market was at its fullest, when the most people would be passing, when the removal of a cooking fire would have the most witnesses and therefore the most message. He brought 2 council members, the compound maintenance officer carrying a formal notice, and 4 men from the village's work crew who would dismantle the cooking area once the notice was served. He had timed it carefully. He had prepared carefully. He was, as he had been for 14 years, thorough. Chiamaka was not cooking at that hour. The evening fire was not until dusk, and the morning was when she prepared, grinding, soaking, cutting, the slow preliminary work that made the evening possible. She was at the compound wall when they arrived. because she was always at the compound wall in the morning, and she had seen them coming from enough distance to have time to understand what she was seeing before it arrived. The notice cited 3 grounds for removal: the compound wall's reclassification as a maintenance hazard, her market cooperative suspension, rendering her technically unlicensed for food preparation in a communal space, and a community welfare concern that had been filed. The notice did not say by whom about the health implications of feeding people with conditions the district physician had designated as infectious. 3 grounds: prepared, documented, legally framed. Served in front of the morning market crowd. She took the notice and read it completely, which surprised the council members, who had expected an immediate response of some kind. She read it the way she read ingredients, completely, before deciding. Then she looked at the compound maintenance officer and said, in the level voice she used for everything that required precision, that the compound wall's maintenance classification had changed 6 months ago, and the reclassification notice had been filed in a month when she had specifically requested and received written confirmation from the council that no changes were pending on this property, and she asked whether that written confirmation had been filed with the reclassification notice, because if not, the process was procedurally incomplete. The maintenance officer looked at the council members. The council members looked at the village head. Ikichukwu said the records would be reviewed. Kiyomaka said she was sure they would, and asked whether, pending that review, the removal should proceed, because proceeding before the procedural question was resolved would expose the council to a counter-complaint that she would be within her rights to file. This was not a threat. It was a question, asked in the same tone as everything else she said. The morning market crowd, which had gathered at the appropriate radius for watching without being part of, was very quiet. Ikichukwu said the removal would proceed, and the procedural matter would be resolved concurrently, and the work crew moved toward the cooking area. Kiyomaka stepped aside and let them. She did not argue, and she did not weep, and she did not appeal to the crowd. She stood at a slight distance and watched them dismantle 3 years of nightly work with the same attention she brought to her fire. Completely, recording everything, deciding nothing until she had seen it fully. The crowd watched her watching, and what they saw in her face was not what they expected. It was not defeat. It was the expression of a woman who has received information she needed and is now deciding what to do with it. In the back of the crowd, a man in ordinary clothing watched with his hands folded in his lap and his ring in his cloth, and his mind completing the third of the 3 things he had needed. The work crew finished by mid-morning, and the crowd dispersed, and the compound wall stood empty for the first time in 3 years. Kiyomaka sat on a low stool at the edge of the cleared space. They had not taken the stool. It was hers in an unambiguous sense they had not wanted to complicate the notice with, and she sat with the emptiness the way she sat with a pot before she decided what to put in it, just being present with what it was. She was not thinking about the village head or the notice or the procedural question she had raised, which was real and which she had raised because it was real and not as a tactic. She was thinking about the people who would come to the compound wall this evening and find nothing. The man with the skin condition who had been eating at her fire for 8 months and whose hands were clear for the first time in years. The woman whose husband had died, who came not because she was hungry, she had food, but because she had somewhere to be in the evening that was not her own compound with its particular quality of silence. The young man who had been excluded from the cooperative and who was, Kiyomaka had understood for 6 months, not actually interested in the cooperative, but in having one place where no one weighed his worth against the village head's assessment of it. She reached into the pocket of her wrap and closed her hand around the thing she carried there, a small, smooth, grinding stone, worn flat on one side from years of use, that had been her mother's before it was hers. Her mother had ground the first medicinal preparation on it that Kiyamaka could remember watching. A paste for her own childhood fever, ground in the specific circular motion that extracted what needed to be extracted without damaging what needed to remain. She held the stone when she needed to feel the weight of something that had done real work in real hands. It was the only thing she owned that she was certain had saved a life, and it grounded her the way true things ground you, not by making the difficult easier, but by reminding you that the difficult is the thing you know how to do. She thought about what the dismantling had told her that the notice had not. 3 grounds were prepared, documented, and legally framed, which meant 3 grounds had been built in advance, over time, by a man who had decided to remove her before he had a public reason to do so. A man who builds grounds in advance for something he has not yet publicly justified is a man who is afraid of what would happen if he did it without them. She had spent 3 years feeding people the village head had excluded, and the village head had spent 6 months building the architecture to remove her, and the architecture told her something the village head had probably not intended to communicate, that what she had been doing had mattered enough to require this level of preparation to stop. She put the grinding stone back in her pocket. She stood up from the stool. She was going to need a new location, and she already knew which one. The eastern edge of the settlement, where the land was technically outside the village's cooperative jurisdiction, which meant it was outside the village head's administrative reach. She had known about this technicality for 2 years. She had not used it before because she had not needed to. She needed to now. That same evening, at dusk, at the eastern edge of the settlement where Kiyamaka had moved her fire, Prince Chukwudi came and sat down as he had come and sat down every evening for 14 days. He was the last to arrive. He sat in his usual place and ate in his usual silence and waited until the others had finished, and the fire had settled, and Kiyamaka was scraping the pot in the manner that said the evening was concluding. Then he reached into the fold of his cloth and removed the ring and set it on the ground between them, facing up. So the seal was visible in the firelight. He did not say anything immediately. He let her look at it. She picked it up the way she picked up any unfamiliar ingredient, completely, examining it from every angle, bringing it close to the firelight, turning it in her fingers. Then she set it back down and looked at him and waited, because she had been cooking for people at this fire for 3 years, and she had learned that what people needed to say came when they were ready and not before. He said he had been eating her food for 2 weeks. He said the food had been telling him things that his official inquiry had not been able to establish in 6 months. Not because the food contained information. He said this clearly, because he understood that she would need the distinction to be clear, but because the people eating the food had been talking, and what they said around her fire was what they would never say in a formal proceeding, and he had been listening, and what he had heard was a very complete account of 14 years of land allocation decisions in Agu Obi that had not been made the way the records suggested they had been made. He said he needed 3 things to act on it. He had the first 2. The third had been provided that morning by the village head, who had given him the specific grounds for district intervention in local village governance that his authority required before he could act. He said he was going to need the elderly healer's records, and he said he thought she should know who he was before he asked her for anything, which was why he had put the ring down. Chiamaka looked at the ring, and then at him, and said that she had known he was not what he appeared to be since the fourth evening. She said that a man who asks nothing, and offers nothing, and simply listens at a fire where everyone else eventually asks and offers something is a man who is there for a specific purpose. She said she had decided by the sixth evening that his purpose was probably useful. She said the healer's records were at the healer's compound, and that she would take him there now if he wished, and that she would like her fire and her compound wall back, and that she assumed those two things were connected. He said yes. He said very much so. And across the village, in a compound where a village head was reviewing the morning's successful removal with the satisfaction of a man whose machine had returned to order, no one knew that the fire had simply moved. Prince Chukwudi moved through 3 channels in the following 2 days, working faster than he would have preferred because Thursday's removal had made the situation visible in ways that could produce its own momentum. The first channel was the healer's records. Mama Agbada was 76 years old and had kept meticulous records of her work for 50 years. Not the records that the district physician had dismissed as unscientific, but the specific, dated, outcome-based records of a woman who had tracked what she did and what resulted, because she had always understood that the difference between knowledge and opinion was whether you had checked. She had been keeping alongside her own work records a parallel record of what Chiamaka served at the fire and what she observed in the people who ate it, because Chiamaka's results had interested her professionally, and because a healer who cannot notice when someone else's methods are working is not paying sufficient attention. 2 years of dated records, specific conditions, specific preparations, specific outcomes. The man with the skin condition was in there. 3 others whose improvements the district physician had been informed of and had declined to investigate were in there. The records were not dramatic. They were what good records always were: quiet, consistent, and very difficult to dismiss. The second channel was the land allocation. The formal inquiry had produced clean records, but the people at Chiamaka's fire had not been talking about records. They had been talking about what they knew from their own experience, which plots went to which families in which seasons, and what the actual pattern looked like when you put 14 years of it side by side. The young man who had refused his assignment had spent 3 years watching, and when the prince asked him to walk through it, he did. The pattern that emerged was exactly what the formal records were designed to conceal, but not designed to eliminate. 4 hours of quiet conversation produced what 6 months of official review had missed. The third channel was the procedural question Chiamaka had raised at the wall. The prince requested the complete reclassification file. Everything was there, except the written confirmation Chiamaka had received 6 months before the notice was filed. Its absence was the kind of convenient that his 10 years of inquiry had taught him to recognize immediately. He added it to the file. The file was ready. He sent for his grandmother on the second day, because his grandmother was the one person in the district whose presence at a formal proceeding could not be managed or redirected by a village head with 14 years of administrative experience. Queen Mother Chidinma was 72 years old and had been the district's senior elder for 20 years, not a ceremonial position, but the specific institutional role that the district's founding charter gave to the eldest senior woman of the governing house, with the authority to convene and preside over any community proceeding that involved the welfare of people who had been excluded from formal complaint processes. The charter's language was specific. People who had been excluded from formal complaint processes. Chiamaka's outcasts qualified on every reading. She arrived the following morning having traveled through the night, which was the kind of thing Queen Mother Chidinma did when she had decided something needed to happen. She went directly to the eastern edge of the settlement, where Kiamaka had moved her fire before she went anywhere else, because her grandson had told her about the fire, and she had decided that the right order of things was to see it before she saw anything official. She arrived at the hour when Kiamaka was preparing for the evening, grinding, soaking the preliminary work, and sat down on a stool at the edge of the area without announcing herself, because she had found, over 72 years, that the most accurate way to understand what someone was doing was to watch them do it before they knew they were being watched. She watched for 20 minutes. She watched Kiamaka smell each ingredient before she used it, close her eyes briefly, decide. She watched the precision of the preparation, the specific sequence, the attention. She had eaten food prepared with this quality of care perhaps 4 times in her life, and each time it had been prepared by someone who had been taught by someone who had been taught in a line of transmission that kept a specific kind of knowledge alive by keeping it moving. She had not expected to find it here. She was glad she had come to see it before the proceeding, because seeing it changed how she understood what Thursday morning's removal had actually been about. When Kiamaka noticed her and stood, the Queen Mother said, simply, that she had heard about the fire and had wanted to understand what it was before she was asked to protect it. She said she thought she understood now. She said she would need to speak with the elderly healer and that the proceeding would be the day after tomorrow and that Kiamaka should continue preparing, because the people who came to her fire this evening still needed to eat, and proceedings took care of themselves, but food needed to be made. The witness the prince had not expected arrived on the morning of the proceeding, sent by no one and invited by no one, having simply heard, the way people hear things in villages where the informal information network is considerably faster than any official channel, that something was happening at the district level about the Agu Obi situation, and having decided at 80 years old that waiting for an official invitation was a luxury he was unlikely to have time for. His name was Mazi Okeke. He was the former district land surveyor, retired for 12 years, who had conducted the original boundary survey of Agu Obi's eastern settlement edge 30 years ago, the survey that established, in the district's permanent record, that the eastern edge was outside the village cooperative's jurisdiction, which was the technicality Kiamaka had used to move her fire after the removal. He had not come because of the fire. He had come because in 30 years of land surveys, he had drawn the boundaries of Agu Obi's cooperative jurisdiction specifically, and he had drawn them specifically because of a conversation with the then village head about what the cooperative's authority should and should not cover, and what he had drawn and what the current village head's cooperative records showed were not the same boundaries. He had noticed this discrepancy 6 years ago. He had filed an observation with the district land office. The observation had been noted, filed, and not acted upon. He had assumed, as 80-year-old men sometimes assume about institutions that have not acted on their observations, that he had simply not been heard clearly enough. He came now because the proceeding gave him a room where being heard clearly was the specific purpose. The proceeding was held in the district hall, not in Agu Obi's village council room, where the furniture and the walls belonged to the village head's 14 years, but in the neutral space of the district, where Queen Mother Chidinma presided and Prince Chukwudi presented, and where the evidence arrived in the order it had been assembled. The healer's records, the land allocation pattern, the missing written confirmation, the boundary survey discrepancy, and, last, the account of 14 evenings at a fire where people had talked freely, because the woman cooking had created a space so clearly outside the village's official categories that its unofficial ones had also released their grip. Ikechukwu had come prepared. He was always prepared. He challenged the healer's records as anecdotal. He offered alternative explanations for the land allocation pattern that were individually plausible. He provided documentation, thorough, clean, well-maintained, for every official decision cited. He was, as he had been for 14 years, competent and composed, and difficult to directly contradict. Prince Chukwudi did not try to directly contradict him. He had learned, from his years of inquiry, that a man who has spent 14 years constructing a coherent official record cannot be defeated by attacking the record. He can only be defeated by standing outside the record and showing what the record was constructed to conceal. He had Mazi Okeke show the original boundary survey next to the current cooperative jurisdiction maps. He had the young man describe the land allocation pattern he had observed over 3 years of watching, not accusing, simply describing in the specific detail of someone who had watched something long enough to see its structure. He had the healer read 3 entries from her records, selected because they described conditions the district physician had officially declared untreatable, and the outcomes she had observed in the people who had been eating Chiamaka's food. And then he asked Ikechukwu one question. He asked whether the written confirmation that had been given to Chiamaka 6 months ago, before the reclassification notice was filed, was in the village council's records. Ikechukwu said there must have been a filing oversight. The prince said that was possible, and that it was also possible that a written confirmation given to a woman before a reclassification notice was filed made the removal on Thursday morning procedurally void, and that a proceeding convened on the basis of a procedurally void removal had implications for every other action in the file. He said this evenly, with the specific neutrality of a man who does not need to raise his voice, because the facts are doing all the work that needs to be done. Ikechukwu looked at the table. He had 4 remaining responses, and he cycled through them in the space of a few seconds, the experience calculation of a man checking whether any of his prepared positions had survived intact. None of them had. He sat with this for a long moment. Then he placed both hands flat on the table and looked at the Queen Mother, and said that he would cooperate fully with whatever review the district required, which was the formal language for a position that had run out of ground to stand on. He said it without expression. He had spent 14 years building an efficient machine, and the machine had failed, and he received this the way efficient men receive failure, as a problem to be managed rather than a feeling to be expressed. He closed his eyes once, briefly. The room was very quiet. The district's findings were delivered over the following week because a full review of 14 years of land allocation decisions could not be compressed into a single session. The cooperative jurisdiction boundaries were corrected to match the original survey, which had the immediate effect of expanding the area outside the village head's administrative reach, including the eastern settlement edge where Chiamaka had moved her fire. The removal of the cooking area was declared procedurally void, and the compound wall was formally restored to its prior status. The land allocation pattern, reviewed against the original allocation criteria, produced 17 cases requiring formal reassignment, a slow process that would take months but had begun. Ikechukwu was removed from the village head position pending the full review, replaced by a temporary administrative council that the district appointed from within Agu Obi's membership, specifically excluding his household's connections. The proceedings' formal record noted, in the section on sources of information, that the most complete account of the village's informal allocation patterns had been gathered through a period of observation at a communal fire at the settlement's eastern edge, at which the district's inquiry representative had been present as a private individual, and that the information gathered there had been essential to directing the formal inquiry toward the specific points at which the official record could be tested against observable reality. The note was dry and administrative. What it described was 14 evenings of good food and honest conversation, and no administrative language had been invented yet for what that actually was. The Queen Mother, leaving the district hall after the final session, stopped at Chiamaka's compound wall, which now had its fire again. She stood at the edge of the firelight for a moment, and then sat down on the stool Chiamaka offered, and she ate the evening meal, and she said afterward that it was the best food she had eaten in 20 years, and that she was not saying this as a compliment. She was saying it as an observation. The food had done something. She could feel it. She was 72 years old, and she still knew the difference. She said Chiamaka should know that what she had been doing at this fire for 3 years was not simply feeding hungry people. It was practicing medicine, in the oldest sense of that word, and it deserved to be practiced without someone dismantling it. Chiamaka said she was aware of that. She had been aware of it for quite some time. The Queen Mother looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising an already high estimate upward, and then she finished her food. What grew between Chiamaka and Prince Chukwudi grew in the specific way that things grow between people who have been watching each other with genuine attention and have both noticed that the other is doing the same thing. He came back to Agu Obi 4 times in the months after the proceeding, for the review sessions, which required his presence, and for the evenings at the fire, which required nothing except the decision to come. She received him at the fire the way she received everything, completely present, without expectations about what would happen next, which he found, after years of official interactions in which everyone wanted something specific, more restful than he had words for. They married a year after the ring came out of the cloth, which is the kind of timing that has its own logic. Enough time to be certain, not so much that certainty cools into habit. The ceremony was held at the compound wall. Chiamaka had been asked for her preference, and she had given it without hesitation, because the compound wall was where the work had happened, and she had no interest in separating the celebration from the work. The Queen Mother attended. Mama Agbada attended, in the slow and careful manner of a 76-year-old woman who has decided something is worth the effort of attending. Mazi Okeke attended because he had been told there would be food, and he was 80 years old, and excellent food remained one of the things he considered worth traveling for. The outcasts came, not as guests in the formal sense, as the people who had been eating at this fire every evening for 3 years, and who came on this evening as they came on every other evening, because they had been invited and they had somewhere to be. The man whose skin had cleared sat next to the woman whose compound had been too quiet. The young man who had refused the land assignment had, in the months after the review, been reassigned to the land he had identified 3 years ago as what he actually needed, and he came with the particular ease of someone whose calculation about the world has recently been confirmed. Chiamaka cooked for all of them, as she always had, and the food did what her food always did, and the evening was the kind of evening that does not require description to be understood by anyone who has ever sat at a fire where they were genuinely welcome. Just before the ceremony's formal part began, Chiamaka reached into her wrap and held the grinding stone for one breath, her mother's stone, worn flat on one side, the weight of real work in her hand, and then put it back. because she did not need it tonight to remember that the difficult was the thing she knew how to do. She already knew. She had known for a long time. 1 year after the wedding, the compound wall at Agu Obi's eastern edge was the location of a formally registered community nutrition practice, a designation the district had created specifically on the Queen Mother's recommendation for the category of work that Chiamaka had been doing without a name for it for 4 years. The designation carried no particular privileges, but it carried standing, legal standing, administrative standing, the standing that allowed the work to exist in a form that could not be dismantled by a reclassification notice. The cooperative could not touch it. The village council's successor administration, the temporary council, had been replaced, after the review's completion, by an elected body that was considerably more representative of Agu Obi's full population than its predecessor, had formally endorsed the designation. Mama Agbada's records had been submitted to the district's health office as an addendum to the inquiry's findings, not as medical claims but as observational records of a specific practice, producing specific results over a documented period. The district physician had reviewed them and written a response that was careful and non-committal, and which Mama Agbada had read and filed without particular disappointment, because she had been receiving responses of that quality from district physicians for 30 years, and had long ago decided that the records existed for the people who would understand them rather than for the people who currently did not. She was, the year after the wedding, teaching 2 of the younger women in the settlement how to keep the same kind of records. She did not know whether they would be used in her lifetime. She knew that they would be more useful for existing than for not existing. Mazi Okeke had been formally invited to resubmit his observation about the cooperative jurisdiction boundaries after the proceedings' findings were implemented, and had done so, and the district land office had acted on it with the efficiency of an institution that has recently been reminded of what happens when it does not act on observations. He found this satisfying. He was 80 years old, and satisfaction at 80 was its own complete outcome. Ikechukwu Nanadi's review had concluded in the 9th month. The land allocation findings had been extensive, and the process of restoration was ongoing, and he had cooperated with it in the same efficient manner he brought to everything, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him, that even in the dismantling of what he had built, he remained organized. He had left the village and was living in the district capital, where his administrative competence was employed in a role that did not give him authority over anyone's land. Prince Chukwudi's methods had been noted in the district's inquiry protocols as an example of how informal observation could supplement formal investigation, and 3 other inquiries in the following year had incorporated a version of the approach. He was aware that the version in the protocols described the method, but not the thing that made the method work, which was that you had to actually be present and actually be willing to listen without knowing in advance what you needed to hear. He had tried to convey this in briefings with the other inquiry officers. He was not certain he had fully succeeded. Some things, he had found, were better learned at a fire than in a briefing room. Most evenings, after the district's business was done and the road back to Agu Obi was still light, Chiamaka was at the compound wall. The fire was the same fire, moved back from the eastern edge once the compound wall was restored, burning in the place it had burned for 4 years before the Thursday morning, and now for a year more. The people who came were mostly the same people, with some additions. The review had restored 3 families to the cooperative whose exclusion had been identified as unjustified, and 2 of those families sent someone to the evening fire. not because they were hungry, but because a place that had held ground for them when nothing else did was a place that deserved to be returned to. Chiamaka fed them. She fed all of them. She smelled each ingredient before she used it, closed her eyes for a moment, decided. She had done this 10,000 times. She would do it 10,000 more. The food did what it always did, which was the only outcome she had ever aimed at. It fed people, and it worked. And the evening was the kind of evening that people remembered afterward as having been nourishing in a way that exceeded what was in the pot, though the pot was also very good. They can dismantle the fire. They can build 3 legal grounds and arrive with a work crew and do it in front of the morning market. They can exclude the ones who matter most and call the exclusion order, but they cannot dismantle what a fire has already fed. She cooked for the forgotten because they were hungry and she could cook. And what she built, one evening at a time, could not be removed by any notice because it did not live at the compound wall. It lived in the people who had eaten there.